Yesterday, when I was coming over, they stopped us at the border to ask us a few questions, which they do. They're very nice. And they asked me, said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Toronto. He says, what's your reason for going? I said, I'm going to an orphanage reunion. And the girl looked at me and said, looked at me as if to say, at this age with white hair, you're going to go to a reunion.
How do you do?
Yeah, it sure is. Changed a lot.
Yeah. Smell, Harry. It's one of the old ones.
I came from 7 right now.
Yeah, but on the map it says
Yeah, well, it's over there.
well, that's what we did for the reunion.
I came out
He met
401.
somebody. Yeah, well, it's over there.
Well, that's what we did for the reunion.
I came out
He met somebody.
Look who's coming there.
Yes, yes. I hope you learn more.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Platform guests, friends of the Georgetown Boys, and fellow Georgetown Boys. I want to say a few words about the significance of this plaque to the Georgetown Boys, what it means to us. And I hope and I am sure that the feelings I express will be felt by all of you. 61 years ago today, the first group of Armenian boys, orphaned in the Holocaust of 1915, arrived here at Cedarville Farm. Today, this dedication of the memorial plaque signifies the interest taken by many Canadians in the history of those boys, many of whom are gathered here with families and friends. The plaque is of particular importance to the Georgetown Boys, indeed to all Canadians of Armenian descent, because it is a reminder of our past heritage.
It was 1915. As war raged in Europe, the government of Ottoman Turkey embarked on a massive and well-planned campaign to destroy its Armenian Christian minority. Driven from their homes, deported to the desert waste of Syria, hundreds of thousands of Armenians fell victim to disease, thirst, starvation, and murder. Countless women and children were abducted, falling captive to Turks and Kurds. It is estimated that from 1915 to 1922, 1.5 million Armenians were lost. The survivors, known in North America as the starving Armenians, were dispersed throughout the Caucasus and the Mediterranean countries, destitute exiles, tortured with pain, and racked with anguish. The news of their suffering shocked the Canadian people. Initially, Canadian contributions to help the destitute were channeled through other relief groups, such as the Lord Mayor's Fund of London, England, and the Near East Relief in the United States. Thousands of these little children were fed, clothed, and educated in hurriedly organized orphanages. By 1922, a desire for a distinct Canadian effort to assist the thousands of orphans prompted the formation of the Armenian Relief Association of Canada. In a lead editorial in The Globe, February 23, 1923, Reverend A.J. Vining, Secretary of the Canadian Fund, writes about reports that are so horrible as to be unprintable. Composed of some prominent Canadians, the Armenian Relief Association came up with a scheme to bring some of these orphans to Canada.
Boys first. We'll teach them to become farmers, and fruit growers.
In spite of government reluctance to allow the admission of Armenian refugees, the association
received permission from the Dominion government to bring to Canada 100 Armenian orphan boys to arrive at its farm in Georgetown, Ontario.
We heard in Cyprus that we were going to go to Canada. No one knew where Canada was. You know?
And one bright morning, 3 gentlemen came into the refugee camp from the Lord Mayor's Fund looking for little boys to come to Canada. So I was fortunate enough, I was picked out.
In June 1923, the first 50 boys, ranging in age from 8 to 12 years, set sail from Corfu, Greece. According to the terms and conditions specified by the Department of Immigration, the children were to be
sound of limb and free from sickness, remain the wards of the association until the age of 18, and to be trained as Canadian farmers.
It was Dominion Day, 1923. They were taken to a farm, bought by funds raised in their behalf near Georgetown, Ontario. Funding came from individuals, church societies, and other organizations. They came from the western cities and villages of Turkey, Ankara, Sinop, Adana, and from the eastern provinces, known historically as Armenia, from Van, Zeytun, and Erzurum. The sons of farmers and traders, merchants and school teachers, poets and artisans. Here then were the remnants of an ancient nation, of which the forefathers had inhabited the land surrounding Mount Ararat for 3,000 years.
No, you didn't. The plastic ones.
All right, you'll find the plastic one there.
Where is the boat? Levon went to bring it.
Yeah, I remember the first day when we got to the home. It was supper time. There was big stacks of buttered sandwich bread and lots of food, and it was what a change, you know.
A friend and benefactor of the boys' farm, in a letter to Prime Minister Mackenzie King, writes,
It was my pleasure to visit the farm. Having known that there was reluctancy on the part of the Ottawa authorities in granting permission to bring these orphans to Canada, it has occurred to me that you would appreciate an impartial report of the work that has already been accomplished. They have made remarkable progress in learning English and employ themselves in improving the property and making themselves useful.
In September 1924, 40 more boys with similar backgrounds were brought from the orphanage in Corfu. Reverend Ira W. Pierce of the Relief Association, in a letter to the Immigration Department, writes,
We're making splendid progress in the education of our boys, and especially in regard to the soil. I'm enclosing a copy of the Toronto Star. A large audience assembled in the town hall here last night for the second annual Armenian Boys Christmas entertainment. These young Armenian boys were a hallelujah chorus, singing a Christmas jubilante. Their English was strangely correct, but they were not at all like rosy-cheeked English choir boys. Their faces were swarthy, not pink, and they were not sopranos, but baritones, as if the sight of parents bayoneted before their eyes had changed their childish trouble to a manly timbre.
We published a paper. It was a monthly paper. We called it Ararat. The boys used to write little things what they learned in their English school, and some in an army, and they used to write little stories.
Every morning school starts with prayer. We gather in the schoolroom every night and sing some English and Armenian songs, pray, and after go to bed. Last week, we started to gather all the white eggs for hatching. During the summer months, many of our boys were invited to go to different YMCA boys camps in Ontario. It was a very good outing for the boys and a good way to meet Canadian boys their own ages.
The farm home was supervised by church ministers, all well-educated men with teaching backgrounds. Additional teaching staff came from the public school system, and the home staff were Georgetowners. The assistant superintendent was A.L. Alexanian, an Armenian teacher whose services as translator were vital in the early days.
There is no Armenian church in Georgetown, but there are 4 other churches: Anglican, Baptist, Presbyterian, and United Church. Every Sunday, all the boys in the body march to these churches in turn and worship.
The front of the church, near the pulpit, the seats were always ready, reserved for us. By this time, we were able to understand some of the English. We used to hum with the choir, and they used to think that was marvelous. And they used to all come and shake hands with us, and that gave the boys more encouragement to learn the Canadian Protestant hymns.
My best time in my young childhood was in Georgetown. There was a small car that I could sit in there and pedal around. That's the only time I think I ever played as a child.
Somehow or other, I did not have the feeling of being an orphan. I wasn't unhappy. I knew my mother was back in the old country somewhere, but day to day, I didn't miss her. Except one day when I was out with Dr. Pierce, and he was giving a talk about Georgetown Boys and the Armenian refugees and Armenian massacres. When he started describing out the massacres, and right in the crowd there, I broke out in tears.
They called her Mayrig, or Mama. Sirpui Budukian was herself a refugee, and it was in her capacity as house mother that she was able to compensate for their deprivations.
And she used to call us Dagas, which means my boy, my boy. Everyone was your boy, you know, so we took a liking to her that we used to go to her, kiss her, and hug her just like as if she was our own mother.
Now, of course, when she came, we were all so happy to see an Armenian woman coming to take care of us, because she showed, as I said, she showed heart and she showed feeling and she showed love for us. And the first thing perhaps we could think of was Armenian food, and so we were all aching and crying for some pilaf. Make us some pilaf, making some pilaf. We would pester her almost daily. So one day she managed to get some bulgur, which is the raw wheat product for making bulgur, and she managed to make some pilaf. And when we were eating it, this was food for our stomachs and it was food for our souls.
Excuse me, I got mixed up. Sorry, I can't sing no more. Got mixed up.
Kind of forgot all the songs I used to know, you know, and I used to know quite a few songs at the time, you know, but when you get away from the talking your language and learning English, whatnot, you almost had to forget what you used to know, you know. Therefore, we had to get to know the grammar of the English language, you know, and so we can pronounce the words proper way.
We used to get an hour Armenian lessons in the morning from 8 to 9. From 9 till 4:30 we used to take English lessons. So we had to learn the ABC, and then I thank him in Armenian.
In 1926 and 1927, 19 boys from an orphanage in Shemlan, Lebanon, brought the total to 109 boys.
What's that, 4 what?
5-4.
5-4.
I am sending you a complete list of names of the Armenian boys at Georgetown. In a good many instances, we have tried to anglicize the names. They could never carry such unearthly names as they now bear through life in Canada. I hope they may consent to change their names. For instance, number 2 has a rather long name, and we have simply translated it into English. This boy is now known as Armenian Jeweler. A number of these boys were named for a famous Armenian general, but in view of the fact that the name is awkward for Canadians, these lads have been willing to take the name of a famous British general. In some cases, the boys were very stubborn and refused positively to have their names changed. I refer to numbers 4, 9, and 15.
Some of the younger boys who had lost both father and mother and all other relatives, all they had left to hang on to was their name. Perhaps they couldn't analyze their feeling, but that's what it was, a total alienation if their name was changed too, because they have nothing left at all of the past.
Sağlıkınız kes, tırgaz astro, sağlıkınız kes, o canıt astuzo. Hak ve tutek.
Again, me, huh? He likes me so much, big man.
By 1928, after 5 years of operation, the Georgetown Boys' Home closed its doors. The property was turned over to the United Church and eventually became a local community center. The Reverend Andrew Lane, committee member of the Relief Association, writes in his memoirs,
I became convinced that it would be to the boys' advantage if they were placed in individual farm homes, carefully chosen, where they should continue school until 16 years. I am sending in the form for one of your Armenian boys and would be very much pleased if you would send him by CPR to Indian River Station.
What troubled many of the boys was that many of them were sent out too young and too weak, and the expectations of the farmers were too great that they expected hired hands.
The little boy Kalust arrived safely and is a fine little fellow. Have you any larger boys there? We would be pleased if you would exchange him for a little larger and stronger boy. We have changed our minds and decided to keep him. He's a fine, quiet little fellow and willing to try anything.
Although the document of indenture was that under a certain age the boys were to be sent to school, and they would only work after school and before school and holidays. But some farmers kept boys out from school for days and perhaps a week at a time, and some of the boys never went beyond grade 2 or 3 for that very reason. And of course it has affected their whole life afterwards. It so happened that there were many good farmers, and I was one of the fortunate ones, and the farmer almost treated me as his son, and he sent to 5 years of high school. His own sons didn't go to high school, but I did.
The Juvenile Inspection Branch continued its program until 1932. By this time, most of the boys had reached maturity and were gravitating to the cities. For a few Georgetown boys, lasting friendships were established with their farm families. But it was Mama Budukian, now settled in Toronto, who provided many a boy brief refuge from loneliness. A few families were reunited.
I am desirous of securing information re the possibility of a young Armenian lad getting across the border. He has an uncle in Philadelphia who is willing to educate him. As a farm laborer, he's getting nowhere. I am in receipt of your letter with regard to the proposition that a 16-year-old Armenian girl should be allowed to proceed to Canada to join her brother. We have a somewhat prolonged correspondence with the Reverend Kalajian of New York City on behalf of a refugee mother of 2 of our boys who has recently come to America.
And some found each other much later.
I hadn't seen my sister since we parted in 1920. 1920 to 1956, be 36 years. We spoke more with love, I guess, than we did with the actual language, because she couldn't speak English, I couldn't speak Armenian.
Some refugee girls were brought to Canada and put into domestic service. But in general, the flow of Armenian refugee children had stopped. By the late 1920s, the Armenian people were beginning to establish colonies in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Greece. They were distressed at the further loss of their already diminished numbers. Their language, their culture, and their identity were as vital to the survivors as life itself. Only by forming strong communities could they hope to continue those traditions. This was also true of the small Armenian communities in southern Ontario. For the Georgetown boys, leaving the farms and coming to the cities, this early community life offered, for some, a sense of belonging. It is caravan time here in this larger and vibrant community center, an annual event when Toronto's diverse communities open their doors to the public in a celebration of culture and heritage. And in celebration of their first day in Canada, fewer Georgetown boys reunite here at the old farm home to remember their special past.
Now I live in Boston. I came here for the reunion. I come here quite often for our reunion because we have a strong bond among ourselves, like one family.